Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Football Law Digital Conference. As you all know by now, if you've been tuning into all the other ones, if you haven't, my name's Sean Cottrell. I'm the CEO of LawInSport. We normally have to wait for a couple of minutes just as we wait for everyone to log in. As you do, I'll run through the basic fundamentals of the Zoom chat we're having today. If you have a question, one, you can use the chat function just to say hello, introduce yourselves, get to know people, do all that type of stuff in the background. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the page. You'll be able to ask questions there, and I'm going to be moderating today, so I'll be able to pick up any questions that you may have. I hope you're all doing really well. This is the final session that we've got. We've made it open access. This is the final session that we've got of doing, this is the 22nd session we've done over a 2-week period. Over 85 of the world's leading speakers continued, obviously, on today's call as well. And we've had over 40 countries, I think it's 44 countries represented. It's been an absolute pleasure and delight to have and engage with so many leading people in the sector of sports law, but more broadly in sport and particularly in football. Our speakers for today are, we have Rushton Centner, who is an associate at LawInSport. At the moment, he's been, just absolutely fabulous. So I'm going to embarrass him. I said he would, and he was hoping I wouldn't. He's been an absolute hero over the last few weeks, helping the conference come together. So thanks for his work with that, but particularly his work with putting together a survey that we've been doing, and many of you would have read the version 2.0, which Michele will talk and Rustam will talk more about. Been putting together over 50 authors contributing to a report on the developments following from the impact of COVID-19. I won't say any more on that, but Rustam, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for all your support. Really appreciate all your help and hard work you've been putting over the last few weeks in particular. Next up, probably doesn't need an introduction, Michele Colucci, EU civil servant and a member of the FIFA DRC dispute resolution chamber. He's also the head of the Sports Law and Policy Centre, which is an organisation that does absolutely fantastic work, publishing many books on sports law and particularly focusing a lot of focus on football, but also is the spearhead and the lead behind the global impact of COVID-19 survey that we conducted. Version 2.1 and 2.0 are now coming up shortly, 3.0. Michele, thanks so much for joining, and he's also one of the happiest people you're ever going to meet in sports law. He's Italian but based in Brussels. Next up, we have Nick DeMarco QC. Many of you, look, everyone in football must know Nick by now. Particularly if you're active on Twitter, you would certainly know him, or on LinkedIn. But if you work in football, you probably would have heard Nick either speak at a LawInSport event, you would have heard him in the press, you would have seen him at the ref conference and the FIFA conference talking about issues around player contracts and transfers. He's also the spearhead of the Football Law book, and he's the author of that book. Many of you would have no doubt ordered a copy of that as well. He's a barrister at Blackstone Chambers, amongst other things, but he's notable for the work that he does in football on player transfers, acting for clubs, players, on competition law issues such as FFP, and across sport and media rights and a whole bunch of different areas, and known as being one of the lead, if not the lead, football lawyer. Nick, delighted to have you with us today. And next up, we have Brendon Schwab. Many of you would have heard Brendon speak our previous webinar on the return to play and the legal issues presented to that. He's the Executive Director of World Players Association and one of the leading figures in the player association, player union movement worldwide, and particularly been a huge driver in the push towards and the recognition and the importance of human rights within sport, which is very relevant given the topic we're discussing today. So that's enough from me. Thanks, Brendon, for joining. So yeah, delighted to have everyone with us today. Really pleased to have this as the final panel. So first up, we're going to have Rustam and Michele, who are going to present hot off the press some key findings from the survey that's been conducted. So I'm going to hopefully, and he says hopefully, share the presentation. So I'm probably going to start it at the wrong slide. Now, can you see that? I'm hoping you can. Right, there we go. And the best place to start is always the beginning. Now I'm going to hand over to you. So Michele, Rustam, over to you. You just need to unmute your mic, Michele. So it was working perfectly a minute ago. There we go.
Thank you so much, Shan, for this wonderful experience. Please allow me to give just 30 seconds of my 5 minutes in total of this presentation, just to say a big thank you. Thank you to all our colleagues, 67 colleagues, 67 generous colleagues all over the world, from Saudi Arabia to China, from Argentina to Norway. They all have families. They all are very busy with their professional activities, and still they found the time to write their pieces for this survey.
Absolutely.
I say thanks in all languages. Grazie, merci, shukran, gracias. You have been fantastic. And I hope that you are satisfied with the work, with the results of this hard work. Shan already mentioned that this has been possible thanks to a teamwork, thanks to Shan, thanks to Alessandro, and above all, thanks to Rustam. We literally worked around the clock.
It's true.
During the last 2 weeks. It has been a hell of work, but also an amazing work. You will read the names of the authors in the second slide, dear Shan. Go ahead. It's impossible to mention all of them, but I'm full of gratitude towards them and towards to Rustam, to whom I give immediately the floor for the following slides.
Thank you, Michele.
Thank you, Michele, for that introduction, and Sean as well for having me here. It is certainly a great opportunity to be able to present this to everyone. So yes, like Michele said, this is indeed a team effort. As you can see from the map on this slide, we analyzed and we analyzed basically the measures taken by 52 different countries worldwide, and what they've done to combat the coronavirus, and that's highlighted in the darker blue shade on this map. Next slide, Sean, please. So just to go over the approach very quickly, like we said, there were 52 countries representing all 6 FIFA confederations. There was the big 5, obviously, which as everyone knows is England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. We then identified 20 other European federations, which you can all see on your screen. There were 10 from the Americas, North and South, 6 from Africa, and 11 from Asia and Oceania. The idea and, well, the aim of this survey was to sort of identify and then analyze themes that have been central to how football has attempted to deal with this crisis. And as you can see, these what we identified was the status of leagues and where we are with the return to play. There were various measures that have been adopted at several levels, governments, federations, leagues. We looked at the employment status of players. Most people would take for granted that players are employees of clubs, and while that is mostly the case, there are jurisdictions where players are considered service providers and they are not really employers. I think these are jurisdictions like India, Japan, Croatia, and I think Romania were ones that stood out. And therefore, employment benefits provided by the government would not necessarily be applicable to these players, and that was an interesting issue to see. We then looked at broadcasting and sponsorship, the role of player associations and collective bargaining as a process. And then we looked at the insolvency, the impact of the virus on insolvency proceedings and dispute resolution. And finally, the topic that I guess is Brendon's sweet spot, pardon me, return to play, and well, the rights and obligations of players and clubs in the event that they don't feel safe returning to training.
What has been the goal of our survey? We wanted to identify the best practices, the most effective measures, or even more the most interesting initiatives that have been taken at worldwide level. Of course, we dedicated a part of our survey to the top 5 leagues and then to the other countries. So what we find out that, of course, now everybody knows, is aware that in France, the championship has been cancelled, and Paris Saint-Germain has been awarded the title of champions. In Germany, the championship has been already resumed on the 16th of May, and in Spain, in Italy, and England are going to be resumed in June. Then we analyzed some measures at different level: government level, federation level. Stay on the other side. The other slide. No. Federation levels, leagues levels, also players associations levels. And what we found out? Therefore, basically, all countries, all governments have adopted measures, general measures, against unemployment, against the risks that the workers in general are facing. These are general measures that as such apply also, of course, to players, football players. In all of them, in all 5 countries, they all have adopted some unemployment schemes. Then, with regard to the federations, we noticed that in England, the English Football League has established a special relief fund to face pandemics. In Germany and Italy, the federations have opened some special line of credit. And finally, it's just a news of yesterday, the president of the Italian Football Federation has announced the creation, the establishment of a special fund, Salva Calcio, Save Football, that has been presented as a totally innovative initiative, but we will see that it has not been the case. Special funds were there also in other countries. Sean, don't move. Stay on the other side. Okay, I tell you what. Okay. Then, with regards to TV revenues, we notice, of course, that the sports stakeholders and TV broadcasters established special payment plans. This has been the case in France for the games already played. And in England, recently, the Premier League clubs have concluded an agreement with the Sky, the TV broadcaster, on a deferral of the payment. Then, interesting to note is that in some federations, like in England, there was already what they call the hardship loan, which is addressed to players in need, and of course, players affected by, touched by the pandemics are also can benefit of this loan. Negotiations have been going on at individual and collective level in all the five leagues. In particular, some clubs have been quite successful in reaching immediately, I would say, agreements with their own players concerning the reduction of the salary. I just recall Juventus and Roma in Italy, but there have been also other clubs, Arsenal, Aston Villa in England, Borussia Dortmund in Germany. And then we spotted this particular situation. In Germany, 4 top clubs literally gave 20 million euros to clubs lower down the pyramid. What a nice example. Now, Sean, you are allowed to
Thank you.
To move on.
Too much coffee. That's what it is. Too much coffee.
Go ahead. With regard to the other 47 leagues, we noticed that all championships are basically on hold, except in countries like in Argentina, Belgium, Cameroon, Cyprus, Kenya, Mexico, Netherlands, and Scotland, where the championship have been cancelled. The same measures that have been adopted by the countries of the Big Five, by the governments of the Big Five leagues, have been also adopted by other countries, all over the world. You see, from Australia to Denmark to Brazil and so on. Then we noticed also that some federation, but just three of them out of the 52 analyzed, had already in place what they call emergency funds. It is the case of Japan, Netherlands, and Portugal. Emergency funds that have been immediately used to face the pandemic. All over these 47 leagues, there have been negotiations going on between players and club, especially with the reduction of their salary, players' salary from 10 to 50%, or for a deferral payment. Another small Cinderella that we found during this interview, the Sapporo players from Japan. These players already received their salaries in February and March. Nevertheless, on a voluntary basis, they gave the money back. Could you imagine? They gave the money back to the club in order to help the management to face the difficult economic moment.
But Michele, so with Japan though, it's worth noting on that point that it's a very, one, that the employment status of players is not a particularly good one, and secondly, that it's a very differential culture that Takeo Yamazaki has talked about a lot already. In that when they're told to do something, generally in the players, it's very it can be difficult for them even to have a player union because of the way the management. So you could argue that is almost to be expected. In the same, I think China was a similar situation in terms of.
Could be. Go on, Forza. Then, so we already know that the FIFA has adopted some guidelines or regulatory issues on coronavirus, and we know. I think that James Kitchen has already touched this topic, stating that of course finally FIFA has recognized coronavirus as a force majeure event, but we need to underline. The way we did it in the introduction of our survey, that actually the impact of this, the force of the coronavirus as a force majeure, is limited to the measures adopted by FIFA to make changes or provide a special dispensation from regulatory regime, for example, for the transfer windows. The concept of a pandemic as a force majeure has been already analyzed by the CAS with regard to Ebola in the past, and of course also by FIFA Player Status Committee, the Dispute Resolution Chamber with regard, for instance, civil law, and whereby of course FIFA has adopted has taken decision on a case-by-case basis. The force majeure is interpreted in different ways, also, of course, on the basis of the jurisdiction at stake. Common law countries and civil law countries. I don't dare to say anything about common law countries, even about CAS, because I'm sure that Nick will touch this with this points. He wrote, I just read before the presentation, I read a wonderful article that he wrote on this topic. Congratulations again. And of course, the civil law countries that where force majeure is recognized as a cause to terminate a contract, but strict conditions apply in order to have recognized this as a cause to terminate a contract. We speak about an unforeseen event which goes outside of the control of a given person, a person that also has to demonstrate, of course, that he has taken all possible measures to enable the other party to perform and to mitigate the damages. Go ahead.
Yes. So as far as broadcasting and sponsorship is concerned, I think broadly the effect of broadcast revenues on countries outside the big five. What we did was we categorized them into three buckets. The first was where the broadcaster has paid or is continuing to pay their installments. This is what we've been seeing in countries like, for example, Argentina, Chile, China, Croatia, Ecuador, I think the Netherlands, Poland, Paraguay are a few more examples. The second bucket is where broadcasters have halted or suspended their payments for as long as football remains suspended. And this is what we're seeing in Denmark, Colombia, Turkey, Uruguay, Ghana, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And finally, we've seen most recently, I think this was day before yesterday, broadcasters having already reached a deal or a settlement, as is the case with Scotland. And I think it's worth noting that obviously broadcasters and sponsors will have to sort of now start being a bit innovative in their approach. And a couple of trends that we noticed were, one, that perhaps governments will start requiring matches to be broadcasted for free. We're definitely going to be seeing that, as we know, in England when the Premier League returns. I think there were 29 matches or so that would be broadcast for free across all platforms, and that's going to be happening in Argentina as well. Alternatively, broadcasters are looking to push out content such as esports with I think there was Colombia that was organizing an esports competition, which apparently was very well received. And finally, again, to bring up the example of Scotland, what happened was in return for a consideration reduction or refund for the 2019-20 season, which was eventually cancelled, broadcasters provided clubs with the ability to live stream their matches for free for the next season, which basically provides fans who obviously won't be able to go to the games, which will be behind closed doors, to watch these games at no extra cost.
And what's interesting, sorry to Rustam, just to add some colour to that from the panels that we had, obviously, over the last couple of weeks on the sponsorship one. Alex Kellum, in particular, highlighted the both opportunity and issues around sponsorship issues that come up when you're broadcasting live matches on free-to-air TV, and depending on what the regulations say in terms of what you're permitted to be able to push out, let's say in an empty stadia, what inventory you're able to promote, essentially, whether it's in a digital form or in a physical form in those events, which is no doubt going to create some, it'll be interesting to hear Nick's view on that, in terms of what that may mean going forward.
Well, I think just to add to that, Sean, on the flip side, where sponsors, obviously in the lower leagues where television coverage is limited, there is likely to be a harsher impact on sponsorship revenue and sponsorship deals there. And we're seeing, like we have on the slide, some countries like Croatia, Colombia, Ecuador, Ghana have already started asking for discounts and suspension of payments.
Yeah, and that seems to be, from the report as well, that seems to be and throughout the conference as well, the same trend. Those leagues, you know, whether it's the big five or others who rely on broadcast revenues, and those who rely on and we see that, Nick, obviously in the EFL, the ones who rely on the gate receipts. There seems to be that clear divide in terms of what the trends that are taking place. The ones who have got the broadcast receivables can cope slightly better, and those who rely on the gate receipts are being harder hit. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to comment on that before we move on. Obviously, we had a panel.
Coming to insolvency proceedings. At this stage, I suspect it's still a bit early days in terms of insolvency proceedings arising directly out of the virus, but there certainly seem to be clubs that are in serious economic hardship. Just to give you an example, in Colombia, even before the virus, there were 8 clubs that were involved in insolvency proceedings. China had, I think, a number, something like, it's on the slide there, 11. And Malaga in Spain, in the second division, is an example of a club that has recently sunk back into financial difficulties just 2 years after going in to difficulties the first time. So definitely, I think Mark Cottrell pointed this out yesterday at his panel, that probably likely to be seeing a few more insolvency proceedings.
Thank you.
Go ahead. With the agreement of Rustam, of course, I changed the title of this presentation. You have to imagine that 3 weeks ago, the initial title of the presentation was, "Will football survive the coronavirus?" Of course it will. Of course it will. It will because we need it. We love it. But how? How will survive it? He will survive it thanks to some measures that have been taken all over the world. Thanks to the common approach, thanks to the engagement of everybody in fighting this phenomenon. We learned a lot. We have been learning a lot. We learned a lot as sports lawyers. I'm sure that from now on, everybody of us, every single sports lawyer will be even more careful when drafting a contract, independently whether this contract belongs to a civil law or a common law jurisdiction. We will make sure that there is always a specific reference to the concept of force majeure in that contract and its effect on the employment or commercial agreements. Then, what are the other best practices or best measures that we have learned from these exercises? Maybe the federation all over the world could be diligent in doing what? In setting up specific reserve funds, like it has been done, we saw it by Japan, by the Japanese, Portuguese, and Dutch Federation, and I'm very happy to say now also by the Italian Federation since yesterday. We should maybe also revise the entire funding systems for the lower level football and for the grassroots. They deserved attention before the pandemics. They deserve even more attention now in the future. The same applies to the clubs. Management have a big responsibility. They will be very diligent and transparent in the way they're running their business and football. And maybe we should reform or revise the accounting rules and the internal procedure of the club. Till 3 weeks ago, everybody was only worried about on how to guarantee the end of a championship. How to have the new football games again. Well, this webinar gives me the opportunity to make a kind invitation to all of you. We need to think beyond the end of the championship of this season. We really need to think out of the box and learn from each other's experience in order to make football sustainable and more and more beautiful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michele. I think that's a wonderful sentiment. I'd like to get everyone's view on whether or not you think that's achievable or not in some of the, an optimistic viewpoint on one I think everyone would welcome, which is more transparency, openness, and greater flow of funds between the different divisions. Next up, Nick, did you want to go next? And then we're going to come to Brendon afterwards to get his view. I'm just going to get, obviously you've got your slides. I'm not sure, Nick, if you wanted to just make any comments before I bring up your presentation or your key points.
It's very illuminating, and thank you very much, Michele, Rustam, and all of you for the work you've done, and particularly the international flavour of it is really, really helpful to us all. I hope to pick up on some of the themes there. because what I think I'm looking at more, that's certainly not my slide by the look of it.
No, you can't see this. Is that what you see?
It's something else, nothing to do with me.
No, sorry,
what
Nick.
I'm going to look at is 5 things in the brief
go.
time I have, which those are they. And the first one is, as Michele said, the thing we were perhaps first and second one, perhaps more focused on, and then trying to look more into the future. So I'm just going to cover those 5 points really. And starting off, you don't need to keep that there anymore. Starting off with, will the season restart? The only reason I highlight this at the beginning is because I think it's still uncertain, even in England, whether the football season will restart. I know we have had various votes and proposals, and the government has said what it has said. My own view is that the Premier League will most likely restart and will most likely finish. And the Championship, I think, is at best 50-50 whether it will, and League One will not, almost certainly. That's my view. And that reflects the points that Sean made in a question about the difference between TV money and gate money. It's simply unsustainable for lower league clubs to play football, and it is almost impossible for Premier League clubs not to play football because of the amount they would have to pay back. And so it really is a commercially driven situation that we're in with the different leagues. But whatever the legal arguments and so on, whether or not it works is fundamentally going to be how this health pandemic plays out. If we have a second wave, if we have a number of players testing positive, the unfairness to players, also to lower clubs in the same division who may not have this, such a big squad and so on, of forcing them to play in those circumstances, all those issues mean I think it's still uncertain. The other thing is that I think the real problem now, though, is not finishing this season, although I'll come on to how we deal with it if it is curtailed in a moment, which is a problem. The real problem now is next season, because not much has been spoken about this, and I don't know if it was picked up at all in Michele and Rustam's report. I have not had time to read the report cover to cover, but certainly from those I speak to in the industry, there's a sense that we may not be having stadiums with supporters in them, with gates open, until at least halfway through next season. In other words, January or perhaps afterwards of 2021. Now, if that's the case, and you're playing half the football season, at least, behind closed doors, that is absolutely devastating for those football clubs who are not overwhelmingly reliant on TV money. Just think about a football club now, its main focus at this time in the year is selling season tickets, because those season tickets are what keeps it going if it's in a Championship or League One or League Two. In circumstances where there is no certainty that you will be able to go and watch a match for the first half of the season, how many season tickets are you going to sell? Some clubs luckily sold them before football went on pause, and they're in a much better position than those who didn't, albeit they may need to be paying some money back. So that's the real problem now. Second point, how to end the season if curtailed. Now, I'm not going to say much about this. You've all heard various arguments. There are so many permutations about what you do, points per game, so on and so forth. The only thing I do want to say, and I'm careful what I say, because acting for some of the clubs, I'll be careful what I say in a public forum, but every different scenario gives you different winners and different losers. And certainly if there's curtailment that affects the Premier League or the Championship, there's going to be litigation, whatever happens, because there will be winners and losers. I just think that some more focus ought to be given to mitigating the number of losers and the extent of loss. And what I mean by that is that whilst everyone is going to have some winners and losers, and it's nobody's fault, it seems to me the worst thing that can happen is relegation if you have curtailment. There's no reason why you need to have relegation. There are various ways you can get around that for a season, but the worst thing is relegation. It's one thing to have missed out on the opportunity to have promotion when it's not your fault, because you might have achieved that by the end of the season had you played those matches. But it is far worse for football clubs to suffer relegation when they could have avoided it. And so I think that needs to be much more put on the agenda, ways of curtailing that avoid relegation.
And why do you think that's not
mechanisms that can do that?
And why do you think that's not currently, why that hasn't been the sort of standardized approach in terms of, why is it, you perceive a reluctance, or is it just...
No, I think it has begun to be much more seriously discussed now at every level. League Two looks like they want to adopt that. The Football Association had perhaps indicated it wasn't in favour of it, but given that the Football Association imposed it on non-league football, it's rather difficult for the FA to sustain that position. I'm not sure they will. And I think we'll see that being discussed more in the other leagues. The focus has perhaps been more on avoiding curtailment, but if there is curtailment, I think that needs to be considered. The third point then is about player wages and frustration and so on. And I'm keen here to stress that one thing, and I say this perhaps, Brendon and I, I'm sure, would agree on these points, but because I'm acting for the PFA in England, salaries, and it's important for players, in my view, to resist moves to reset football, which are really about redistributing money away from the players and back to the clubs. There is a movement to do that and to use the crisis to do that. And there are some real concerns, but there is also, that is a real issue in football. And the reason I say that is that if you look at the way the PFA has approached this issue, it seems to me, and I would say this, but it seems to me it's been correct to say deferment as opposed to wage cuts. And the reason for that is if you've got a position where everybody is trying to get the season to come back again so that the revenue still comes in, to have wage cuts where the players then don't get the money and the clubs then get it, actually simply means redistributing the money from the players to the club. To take a stand against that. And also in relation to deferment, to say, and this has been proposed, but it hasn't been fixed by leagues, I think it should have been looked at. It's not right for a club to defer the wages of its players if it's allowed to sign new players on higher salaries and pay big transfer fees. Because how can you justify to a player, oh, we don't have enough money to pay you what you'll normally pay, but we're going to buy a player from someone else and pay him more money. So, you know, registration embargoes ought to be looked at for the period of time in which there are deferments of salaries. And then finally, on this point, in relation to the frustration and force majeure issues that Michele mentioned, not only legally is it, and I believe it will remain impossible in the court and in England, to have a system whereby you can say, because of a global pandemic and a football player not being able to play the matches through no fault of his own, you can rip up the contract. Not only is that impermissible in English law, for various reasons I don't have time to fully explain now, but it's also commercially and practically completely impossible and implausible. And the reason for that is the way frustration works in England is that it's not a remedy that you can elect to use, say, well, you've breached the contract, therefore I decide to terminate it. It's effectively the court saying, because of no fault of either party, the parties are released from their obligations. Now, football contracts in England and virtually everywhere in the world, in fact, are standard contracts. And if you say this event frustrates a contract and means both parties are released from their obligations, the effect of that is that every Premier League player can walk out of their contract with a Premier League club. And football clubs are not going to stand for that because they will lose all of their assets. And you might say, well, lower clubs might not care, but if there are if everybody's free to walk out of the contract, you can't have football clubs operating. and you will have no integrity in football either. So it simply doesn't work in football, this concept of frustration in employment contracts, and I don't believe it's going to work in the future. Fourth point, dealing again with financial issues, future financial implications of the pandemic. There have been some interesting discussions. Again, I think we need to be cautious about jumping to conclusions that look at resetting the whole of football. But there are important questions. The salary caps are now being seriously considered at League One and League Two level in football for the first time for a long time. Now that would signal a dramatic change in football. And I think that these things ought to be considered very carefully, and there should be no rush into them. I can't myself see how salary caps can work in football. They might work at lower league clubs to a certain extent, but the problem with a salary cap is, how can you have the Premier League agreeing to a salary cap if Premier League clubs are going to be able to properly compete with clubs in Spain and Italy and Germany and so on? And then you say, well, could we have a global salary cap? Well, how can you have that when you have such a big economic differential between the football countries and the nations of the world? It simply doesn't work. That's why, yes, it may work in an American league in the United States, but as a global phenomenon in football, where the money in football is so different, it just
we've seen that problem in rugby, haven't we, Nick? That's one of the problems in European rugby has been.
One of the problems in European rugby, but it would just be like on steroids in how big are the differences in money. And you know, in addition to that, you might say, well, it might work for lower league clubs, but then wouldn't that just increase the gulf between lower league clubs and clubs at an elite level?
I think very interesting points, and very well, as you'd expect, very well made points, Nick. We've got some questions. I'm keen to give Brendon a right to.
Can I just go to my last point?
You can.
Not that last one, but just before Brendon, I want to go to my last point because it was my no doom and gloom point, and I want to end on a no doom and gloom point if I can. Because it does seem to me that this pandemic and the crisis is certainly the biggest challenge to football that there has ever been, and that it's going to severely impact the finances of clubs and everybody involved in football, including all of us who are football lawyers. It's going to severely impact us for a while to come, not just a matter of months. And it may be that we don't have football properly operating for a couple of years. But the no doom and gloom point is this: whereas we've seen and learned, I think, through this pandemic, that there are certain industries that, because of the changes we've all experiencing, like this one now of our video conference, that airline industries, perhaps commercial property and offices, there are certain industries which may actually be in terminal decline as a result of the cultural changes that COVID-19 has caused the world. Football is not one of them. Live football is something that, when the pandemic is over, will come back. As Michele said, it's something that you cannot replace. It's something that's so important. It will come back. The money will come back into it. It will grow again. And we need to hold our nerve about that and realize that the next 2 years may be rocky, but it's not the end of the world, and we don't need to reinvent reinvent the wheel and reset everything.
Thank you, Nick. Sort of very well made points there. So we had a question earlier on during the presentation from Sean Dodson saying, I think I remember seeing, but could be wrong, did the women's club cease operations in England? So did the league cease? And the answer is yes. Nick, Rustam, you may want to answer this. I believe they're currently working out still the formula to decide who's won the relegation, etc., and all the points that you've discussed at the moment. That is included, I believe, Rustam, in the report.
Yes, that is.
Yeah, so that's your answer. Now, Luis Villalobos Perez, you put your hand up. I just want to see, I'm going to allow you to talk if you want to. I'm going to, just because you put your hand up when Nick was talking, was your question answered, or would you like to ask a question? If not, we'll come on to Brendon. So I'll just, yes, it was. Okay, there you go. So I'm trying to unmute your mic. You should have had a request. Hopefully. He says hopefully. Okay, well, we'll leave it on and then we'll come back. If it works, I'll leave it on. We'll hear you when you come back in. Over to Brendon. What's your
thanks, Sean. And yeah,
oh, sorry, I think Lewis has got his mic working. Sorry, on that point, I'm just teasing you. I'm teasing you, Brendon. Lewis. No, you go for it. We'll come back to Lou. Over to you, Brendon.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Look, really want to congratulate the previous speakers, and particularly Michele and Rustam for the work. It really shows the diversity of the experiences that even a sport like football has had at the World Players Association, because we confronted this at a global multi-sport level, and so therefore the experience was even more diverse than that. And not all of the seasons, for example, were underway. Some, such as Major League Baseball and the winter sports in the Southern Hemisphere, had yet to commence. Others at an advanced stage, or at the stage where most of the player contracts had been paid and most of the revenue had come in, and the economic adjustment was less challenging than, say, for others. The real challenge of this, I think, is that never before in our working lives have we had to confront a matter beyond our control, which had such profound economic and health consequences at a player level and at a public level, over a matter none of us had really had any expertise in order to deal with. And so there's a dearth of knowledge, but there's not a dearth of impact. The magnitude of the impact is profound. Now, we then have to negotiate our way through that. Incredible economic, incredible health consequences, limited knowledge, and limited time. The shutdown happened suddenly. One of the things I think is really important to understand in any negotiation, and I think it's really overlooked a lot, is the importance of time and what that means to leverage. And so the type of responses that you can see ultimately won't come down necessarily to what's right, what's wrong, what's in the best interest of the sport, what's in the best interest of public health, what's in the best interest of the players. It'll come down to leverage. And here we had two top major forms of negotiations that would unfold. Strong collective negotiations where the players are organised, or you'd have a more individualistic, unilateral type of approach. In the main, what I would say is that the players have responded with a desire to come back to play as soon as possible, and have been very responsible economically. That's not to say the negotiations haven't been tense or difficult. And many players have, of course, been the subject of a lot of criticism for not coming to the table on pay cuts and other issues like that at a time when the community is suffering so much hardship. What I would like to do is just focus briefly on return to play and what we felt were what are the guiding considerations, not only as we go back to play and work, because it is work, but also how we monitor that. And we've had the great opportunity to listen to the player associations over the course of the last couple of months, expert epidemiologists, expert public health authorities, the sports physicians, the sports scientists, and so on. The first thing I would say is that public health must come first. We've seen a very strong desire, even on the part of the athletes, that led to the postponement of the Olympic Games, is that they did not want to be seen to be exacerbating or undermining the public health effort. And so therefore, the external environment is critical to the capacity to return to play. And if we look at the situation in England and the United States, we would have to say that the public health effort is more challenged there than it is, for example, in Germany or, say, Australia and New Zealand. The second is we have to deal with the specifics of COVID-19. Now, there's a really important point here, and that is that because the government makes a public health pronouncement, that is a different issue to occupational health and safety. But the two become related in a very important way. If the government eases restrictions, the pressure economically is on sport to come back quicker, which gives the sports much greater leverage to negotiate a return to play as soon as possible because of the economic pressure. But a public health clearance is not a safe workplace, and we have to be acutely aware of the differences. Now, if we look at a lot of the protocols that have been put together, they're very strong on the issue of even quarantine leagues, distancing, what we would call measures to protect the virus from entering the workplace environment or spreading. And if there are positive tests, and there needs, and I won't go into detail now, there needs to be a massive amount of testing in the sport place environment, basically because we're doing contact sport and we've got a pandemic with a contagious disease. So clearly the testing has to be at a very high level. That has gotten all the attention. But what actually happens if an athlete contracts the virus? People say exclude that athlete. Well, that athlete needs to be treated. I read overnight about an Australian man, 30 years of age, who passed away. We are still dealing with a highly contagious disease which can't be treated by drugs and for which there is no vaccine. And an athlete, by putting themselves into a contact sport environment, are clearly entering a hazardous workplace. And so therefore the risk needs to be managed. Now, as a broad consensus, our group has not said we can't come back. How do we manage that risk? And that becomes a really critical issue. Now, one way we don't manage it, this is probably the third point I'd like to make, is putting the legal and the economic risk onto the athletes. Now, we've seen a big debate about waiver clauses and exclusion of liability clauses, and we can argue whether they're enforceable or not, but to be honest, the enforceability of a law often comes down to time and resources. But Rustam made a very good point. Not all athletes are employees, and even in some jurisdictions, some of the athletes who are employees are not covered by workers' compensation legislation. And so historically, they've compensated for that by bargaining at common law or bargaining into collective bargaining agreements, private insurance arrangements, which may or may not cover the virus. Loss of future earnings, the illness attacks the lungs, it damages other organs. And so the capacity of an athlete to return to the highest level of fitness, not just general health, is a very significant issue. And so we want to really trace and monitor the impact of the virus on those that contract it and make sure that the treatment is at the highest possible area. The fourth point gets back to about health and safety is really quite interesting in terms of this focus on, say, the quarantine or the hubs. And you may remember that debate was very strong early on. We need to place the players in quarantine. That may be better from a physical health point of view, but a lot of the players resisted that from a mental health and social well-being perspective. So we actually had a difference between the more pristine the environment, the greater the mental and social well-being risks, and the perhaps the less, and vice versa. So we had to try, and we still have to try and get that that balance right. The fifth element of return to play is that sport is risky anyway. So the normal health and safety precautions should be in place. Can athletes who suffer a serious injury immediately access the hospital system? Can we get the same level of medical care into a quarantined workplace environment to ensure that the athletes are supported? And of course, what about this issue of load? I'm here in Switzerland, and I just looked at the Swiss League announced, and I'm sure this is typical, the Swiss League announced that it's going to complete a season that was originally scheduled to be completed in about 85 days. They're now going to complete it in around 45 days. A reduction of 6.5 days per game to 3.5 in circumstances where athletes are coming in from a low base because they've been in a shutdown environment. That, I think, is a recipe for injury. And also it may exacerbate the COVID-19 risk because of the pressure that can put on that can drain the athlete, and increased immunity depletion can also prove to be very problematic. So this is an area that will need to. We saw an immediate spike, for example, in the Bundesliga. Too early to know whether that's a long-term trend or a medium-term trend, but it certainly doesn't surprise the player associations who have been acutely aware of this issue of load and overwork.
So Brendon, what you're doing is you're painting a picture. So obviously we've seen that we've gone basically essentially from these global trends that Michele and Rustam articulated to Nick talking about, articulating really where the legal tension is going to be. And why it's important not to give up too much ground or react too quickly. And you've kind of echoed the same sentiments really with this issue of time, that I'm actually pausing, understanding what's going on, getting a real handle of the changing environment is very important. Now it must have been a good talk that you've all given, because we've got 10 questions to run through. So if you can all turn your mics on and get ready to jump in on whoever wants to do this, and I'll try.
But Sean, let me just make one more point in terms of that. So that's how we're trying to.
As long as it's just a quick one.
Yeah, no, it's an important one though too, because I want to talk about opt-out, because every player is in a different situation, and this is a very important point. And this goes to duty of care as well. It's not only the players who are vulnerable, it's their families. And we've had very strong feedback from players, say, with children who may have respiratory illnesses or who may be living with infirm parents. Let's not lose sight of the fact that this is a highly contagious illness. And so that broadens the discussion beyond the player. And that was really just the final point I wanted to put in to the mix.
And that's an excellent point, and an extremely important one, particularly when you overlay that with your point about access to healthcare system and what that could mean. So, thank you for making that. So Mark O'Neill has said, will the current situation necessitate the need for governments to provide financial assistance to clubs below the top flight who have been badly affected and may not be able to resurrect their revenue streams for some time? And should state aid legislation allow for government to pick up this pandemic when it is over? Now, this is something we touched on with Marianne, who's a state aid lawyer. So, Mark, if you haven't even watched, I think you're on the webinar for that. You should definitely check out that, because, and again, our speakers will know more about that. Does anyone want to cover that relatively quickly, though, in terms of, I think you've kind of touched on it already, but Nick, Rustam, Michele, Brendon, do you think that it's the government job to step in and help lower league football?
Can I answer it in connection with the third question? So you do two.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
I saw Joseph Pridmore, I think, asked about some MPs who've talked about a football finance authority. I was actually going to mention that because I thought it was a really interesting idea. I'm not sure about it, but it's a very interesting idea. The idea they've put forward is for the lower league clubs who don't have enough money, a football finance authority, which is effectively state aid, government money, invests in the club, but rather than it being a loan, takes shares in the club and some ownership of the club, and puts directors on it, and it works with the PFA and football supporters and so on, and puts them on the board. I think that's a really interesting idea to look at. I mean, there are lots of problems with it, not just the state aid one. Also, what about integrity issues? If you've got a government body controlling some clubs and not others. So there's all sorts of problems with it, but it's certainly, these are the types of things we need to look at. The other thing I would say, though, and this is probably very controversial and unpopular, is that there are almost certainly too many clubs in League One and League Two which are financially unsustainable, and were financially unsustainable before this pandemic, and this pandemic has just made that clearer. And the extent to which borrowing or government money ought to be put in to keep these things surviving, which ultimately are not going to survive, is something that one needs to really think about.
Nick, what you're describing there is something that we've talked about for some time, and particularly over the last 2 weeks, is this social license of sport. That if you're going to be, if the club is there and it is a community asset and it's providing, then it has a greater impact than just what happens on the field of play. I'm not sure if anyone else wants to comment on that. The other comment I've got is something to think about is public-private partnerships have not been that successful in the railway, for example, in the UK. They don't seem to work out too well when you have that conflicting model. Does anyone want to comment on that? Michele, or yep, do you want to go first?
If you allow me.
Of course.
I think that, this is the time really that we have the opportunity to look at all different ideas, all the measures and the solutions that have been taken at several levels, at worldwide level. Listen, I give you the example that Brendon was talking about the protocols. Okay, if you think about the situation in several federations, just 3 months ago, it was a disaster because you had some federations which were a little bit, please allow me to say, a little bit more developed than others. They at least tried since the beginning to put in place some protocols, while others, they even did not think about the protocol. You will find out that, there are, in some countries, there are association of sports doctors, just in a few countries. In some others, there are not. Some federations created some technical medical committees. The others didn't do that. Now it's really the time to tackle a phenomenon, an exceptional phenomenon as a pandemic, from different perspectives. Everybody must play a role. Government, federations, leagues, clubs, players, everybody, and we show it through the survey, everybody could and should play a role. From the governments establishing employment, unemployment, special unemployment schemes, thinking about the idea of, participating, if it's possible, in some way in the business of the clubs. I see a lot of risks, honestly, in terms of state aid and not only state aid. But we are facing some special exceptional circumstances that we have to explore all possibilities, all possible solutions. But for me now, it's time to gather everybody, representatives from the governments, representatives from the players, from the clubs, from the federation, at worldwide level. Gather together, share the knowledge that you have acquired now in order to use it in the future, because you can be sure, it is sure that you will have other pandemics or other exceptional circumstances. And watch out, Brendon said that we have been facing it to some time constraints, limited knowledge. But if we share our findings, maybe we will be much more effective in finding this.
Michele, I love your enthusiasm. You're one of my favorite people because of, and I think we've had comments about it, and I think everyone would agree, right? The having any interaction with you is a positive one and an uplifting one, because you are a collaborator, you are a share of information. But and I agree with you, by the way, wholeheartedly. However, we're operating in an environment where in sport, and was articulated earlier today, where people compete against each other. And so whilst I agree with you wholeheartedly, absolutely we should see that collaboration. I'm less convinced that we already see it in the reaction to the crisis. Some people are doing their own things separately. They're not collaborating with others already.
But they are destined to die. They are destined to die.
Not a good choice of words at this moment. I understand what you mean.
They are destined to die. If we don't take this as an opportunity to share what we have learned,
I agree.
And we are lost.
Yeah.
We are lost. And why should I not share my small knowledge with you? I learned so much by doing this report, by listening to you all. But I want to move on, go farther.
I agree. Sorry, Brendon, did you want to come in there, or Rustam?
Yeah, look, I think the big focus now is on the economics and how we restructure the industry. Nick, I wouldn't assume that those clubs are not viable. I think there's been a lot of revenue, but there's been a lack of control of costs. There's been poor governance and really problematic ownership, and the system feeds it. So there are a lot of examples in other leagues where clubs were written off for merger or insolvency years ago, and now they're massive, successful organisations because they got their social licence back. I think one of the most extraordinary lessons in this is simply this, that after 30, 40 years of record revenue, our industry was in a crisis within weeks, if not days, after the pandemic. There was no liquidity. And so the industry needs to be governed in the overall best interests of the sport and all the material stakeholders. And we're seeing an inequality, particularly in football, which is less pronounced in other sports. And I think football could learn from other sports, where we say, well, look, just like we're seeing in the broader society, it was the more vulnerable economically and socially that were hit harder by the pandemic from a health point of view.
Absolutely.
And so that, I think, is the philosophy. And if we're going to bring people together, experience suggests that we have to first try and agree on some guiding principles. And football's the law of the jungle. And the other sports, which are more collective, more socially based, I think the Americans, I'll just say this very quickly, the Americans laugh. The home of capitalism is the home of socialist sports leagues. And in Europe, the home of the social contract is the home of capitalist sports leagues.
On this point of that you're raising, and I raised this point before the pandemic, which was in the UK we've got the Code for Sport Governance, in which certain criteria have to be met in order to get access to the funding. And a lot of the issues in football seems to be about like people trying to access capital and having this liquidity, and so it drives them, right? So we need to be doing more successful to get the promotion. Therefore, we spend more on player wages, and it drives this ongoing process. Perhaps there's we've seen FIFA and the leagues that Michele and Rustam have talked about come together with financial packages. Perhaps it could be conditional on these criteria, as Michele was saying, to promote others. Right, next question up. How can the integrity of the respective decisions respective decisions be truly implemented without promotion and relegation, whether by completing the season or via, I presume that's points per game, PPG? This is surely just gives an excuse for poorly performing clubs to get out of a get out clause. Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, can I do that?
Yeah, go for it, Nick. Yes.
And also the Nottingham Forest fan who asked a similar question. And I certainly hope Nottingham Forest return back to the Premier League where they belong as soon as possible. But I think the answer to these questions, there's a few questions that are similar to these about promotion and relegation. The difficulty is integrity of the competition is undermined if you have any system of promotion and relegation on curtailment, on one view, because the whole idea is, like a marathon, you play every team home and away throughout a whole season, and it's based on your performance of that you get promotion or relegation. And if by pure chance the season stopped at this point and you have been denied the opportunity of either doing really well and getting promotion or getting out of that relegation zone with those last few games, which many clubs do in that last period, then that is completely unfair. And it undermines the integrity to reward or punish you as a result of that. So that is one view. And that view would suggest you don't have any promotion or relegation. Now, I'm not saying that necessarily. I'm saying have no relegation at least, because that is worse. And in answer to the Nottingham Forest question, I'll give you a very good example. The biggest problem with the Championship is the playoffs, because not only do you have 4 clubs potentially now in the playoffs, you've got another 6, if you look at the points, who could easily be there if you play another 4 matches. So how do you determine that if you don't have the playoffs? Very, very difficult. But saying no club should be punished and actually be relegated is easier, and it seems to me to be something you should do. And then you should look at what you can do to resolve the problem at the other end.
Okay, I'm not sure if does anyone want to comment on that? Or shall I move on to the next question? Next question then. Is the salary cap not specific? Is the salary cap not a specific figure cumulatively rather than a specific player, specific to each player? So the amount for each club, perhaps implemented relative to FFP rules or a global figure, can be the same for each club. So basically talking about a soft salary cap as opposed to a hard salary cap. Who wants to chip in on that?
Well, he's right. That's what's being proposed.
Yeah. Any views on it though, in terms of Brendon?
Well, Sean, obviously being from Australia and working with all the US sports, we have a lot of experience with salary caps. The important thing to understand is they only exist in a certain environment. There's strong revenue sharing between the clubs to ensure that the clubs have a relatively equality of spending power, this enables the Green Bay Packers to compete with the Dallas Cowboys, for example. There's a very strong capping of agents' fees, normally around 3% of player, and a very deep regulation of agents. Transfer fees are normally prohibited in these leagues because they undermine competitive balance by encouraging the bigger clubs to purchase players who we want to keep at the smaller clubs so that they can translate that into on-field success. It's a culture of equalisation, and there are many devices that go into it, of which the salary cap is one, which was one conceived of through collective bargaining in basketball in the early 1980s. You can't pick and choose on this kind of stuff. And really, if you look at a salary cap without the broader reforms, it's just a device to keep management's control over player costs. And the other thing I would say too, where these salary cap works, the contracts are publicly available so that there's complete transparency, and the economics are publicly available as well, so we have transparency. Soccer would be having to sign up to all of those conditions in order to do it in an effective way, and I think there'd be huge barriers to those conditions being agreed to.
So salary cap comes with other conditions in place. Now, one thing I'm going to ask for people, and I keep saying it to people, and I'm generally serious about this, which is bad luck for you guys because I'm the host. I'm quite dyslexic. And so even though I run Law in Sport, if you're going to ask a question, please can you just write the question so I can answer it rather than writing a paragraph of like an essay. It just makes it very difficult to get to the actual question. So if you've got a question, if you want to elaborate on it, please just put your hand up. I can turn your microphone on. It's going to be much easier. But please, just for speed of us to get through this. So for example, Bilal Misra, thank you for asking a nice, short, succinct question. Is it time now to trial the US system of player drafts for the lower leagues in UK football for cultural equalisation? So having that, what does everyone think about the sort of the US model for drafts being potentially for lower leagues? So you're drafting players in and they get distributed out to the various clubs as opposed to the transfer system. Sounds problematic. Who wants to take that?
Well, I'd speak for 30 seconds. You're the best young kid in the world and you get drafted by a relegation-prone club. Again, did you write? We all saw The Last Dance. Michael Jordan's drafted by the Chicago Bulls and he can turn it into a winner because all of the other stuff's in place. It's just a relevant topic. He's an exceptional athlete. You want your best young talent to go to the worst club, which means that worst club has to be a world-class club. And in the absence of all that broad structural reform, these things just can't work.
Right, okay. And there's a comment in the chat, but I'll come back to that later. Richard Odogo, how will UEFA relegate FFP play given the harsh impacts of pandemic so basically how is UEFA accounting for FFP? Like I said, we covered some of this in previous sessions, but I appreciate this is an open one, so certain people probably didn't tune in for that. But they want to talk, they've relaxed the FFP regulations slightly, but how do you think, is it going to go further? Is it going to be a wholesale reform of FFP given the financial pressures? Does anyone want to, Michele or Rustam or Nick? No one wants to touch that. Don't know is the answer. We'll have to wait and see.
I'm happy to touch it. It's just
you go for it, Nick.
Another question. I don't want to be answering too many questions, but just on FFP, I always say this, so the biggest problem in England is the EFL's FFP rules, not the UEFA ones, which don't affect that many clubs, because the EFL rules are very, very restrictive in my view. And if they are not relaxed, you're going to have probably half the clubs in the Championship failing them next year, which would just be ridiculous because you'll end up having the season determined by lawyers arguing about points deductions rather than on the field. They obviously need substantial relaxation given the given the impact of COVID-19. Remember, the problem with these rules is that they prevent investors investing. That's what they actually do. An investor could say, I will put in 10 million to cover these losses, and then they're treated as losses. So to do that in this climate makes no sense. Now, while I'm on that, can I answer my good friend Robin Bloom's question?
You can, yes.
Who asked very well, and I agree with what Robin says about the fact that one shouldn't be too confident about money coming back into football, basically given the general global economic crisis. And Robin is absolutely right. I'm not saying everything.
So for those people, so Nick, sorry, can you just elaborate for those people that can't see the question?
So Robin says, why is Nick so confident that money, have you moved it? I can't see it. No?
Oh, sorry, I just moved it. Yeah, so I did. It's in the answered part. Sorry.
Right. Okay. How do I?
So
why is Nick so confident that money will come back into football when Spurs need to borrow 175 million from the Bank of England emergency fund? Does not this reflect the serious systematic issue the pandemic presents? Global financial failures led to loss of commercial income and less broadcast revenue, etc. Yeah, absolutely right. But my point is that structurally and economically as a model, football will continue to be an extremely there'll continue to be a mass international market to consume football that's very hungry for live football, and hopefully Premier League football will still be the most popular for those of us operating here. That will continue to be the case, where it may not be the case in other industries. That doesn't mean to say, what is true about what Robin says is we are all going to get poorer, apart from the person who invented Zoom or whatever. We are all going to get poorer for the next God knows how many years, and we're all going to be in massive debt. But relative to other things, football, I think, will retain the position it has had before. But Robin is right that a lot of it is also financially unsustainable at different levels.
On that point then, and this is maybe a question for Michele, because you were so vocal, as Thomas Nolan's asked, I would be interested in the panel's thoughts on how clubs, football generally, governing bodies might protect against economic damage of particular similar outbreaks in the future, particularly when insuring against such a risk may be more expensive and difficult than before.
Okay. So listen, I think this question is also related to the other one that you don't want to take it from Conrad Gibbons, who asks whether COVID-19 will hasten the growth of inequality in financial inequality terms between the Europe's biggest clubs and the leagues against the other European leagues. Listen, we have saw that now there have been several measures that have been adopted. Some economic measures coming from the governments to the workers, so also is a minor part to the football players. Some federations, yesterday the Italian Federation created this special fund that will give 21 million euros, especially to clubs of second, third category in amateur clubs. Yes, there is a risk that the difference in inequality will be bigger and bigger. As a child, I experienced an earthquake in my region where 3,000 persons died. 3,000. It was a disaster. There was a lot of solidarity across all over Italy, across all over the world. Money was coming in. To whom? Just to few of them. I remember my grandmother says, the richer are becoming richer, the poor are becoming poorer. This is a risk that we may face, and we have to avoid this. If some money will go, I don't know, from federations, governments, or leagues, or TV broadcasters, we have to make sure that this money will go to the right persons.
Whose responsibility is it? Who do you think's responsibility is it? Because one of the challenges is with the government.
The responsibility again of everybody. There's a monitoring. The monitoring. Brendon, you use the word monitoring. It's not enough to establish or to adopt a measure. It's not enough. It's just the beginning.
But but my point is, Michele, like in football, when you have problems, as has been articulated before, in terms of how the governance structure runs, when you have council, when you have multiple levels before you actually get a decision made, right? So by the time it actually gets there,
let's suppose
a decision. On a global scale, how do we? Should it be
to organize? Listen, you can start organizing it really from a national level. Let's suppose that you have the federation giving money to the clubs. To the clubs, you have to make sure that this money is well reinvested. Salaries are paid to the players, to the staff, to the coaches. Maybe you can involve in a monitoring body. You can involve representatives from everybody, representatives from the players, representatives for the clubs, supporters, everybody who can monitor the situation. In order to, every system, everything. You know what? Please allow me to say things. Maybe nobody has said it. Please don't think that I say this because I'm a member of the FIFA Dispute Resolution Chamber. I'm just an humble judge to the service of football. That, I don't know if you know this. It's the very nice thing about these guidelines that have been drafted is that, if I correctly understood, they have been drafted in cooperation with all the sports stakeholders. It has not been something that has been imposed by FIFA or others. No, it has been, if you want to give credibility to a system, to a measure or something, you need to involve as many as persons possible.
But at the moment, one of the dynamics is, and I think it's a very good point you make about cooperation, and I'd like to get Brendon's view and Nick's view in terms of what role the players play in this. So let's run with Michele's thought experiment, right? There's more transparency, right? And there's more accountability, and it's everyone's job to step up and make sure that there's the funds that are redistributed, right? At the moment, that makes perfect sense because the tap's been turned off. So you have to collaborate because everyone's trying to survive. When the tap comes off sporadically, right, around Europe and others, and different things happen, how do you ensure, and what role do players do in terms of helping, having a positive impact in that has been one of the key stakeholders?
It's for me.
For Brendon.
For Brendon.
Or Nick. Or Rustam.
Nick, you go first.
You've been quiet for a while, Rustam.
No, Brendon, you go first.
I think all of these problems can be solved. But there needs to be, for people to come together, it requires more than a commitment of listening and so on. There needs to be a concrete sharing of the guiding principles upon which a new economic model for football is to be anchored. And at the moment, those principles are very much about the need to develop and sell players, the need to get control of the best available talent, the need to get owners who are willing to invest above and beyond the revenue base of the club in success, and the need to participate in international competition, such as the European Champions League, and the need to avoid relegation. So there's a lot at stake all of the time, and it encourages short-term thinking. But that is maybe embedded. It might be part of what makes football what it is, but it comes at a cost. There can be an alternative model developed, and we've seen that throughout the world. All have their tensions. The US system has probably much greater tension between labour and management, for example, than what the European system does. The European share of revenue is actually higher for players than it is in the United States. So they're different models. They all need to be understood. But unless and until you can get that particular agreement, it's going to be difficult. What I would say, and what I like about New Zealand Rugby, for example, is the players there take a lower share of revenue to ensure that the game invests in the grassroots. That it's not that the players are as much bought in to the long-term development of that game, and they've produced in a small country an iconic international brand and a team that tends to win the World Cup more than most, and that is another model as well. But unless you can get that broad commitment around those fundamental principles, it's going to be difficult to get the stakeholders to unite.
So one of the things that came up in all of this has been that the players haven't, you know, we talked about before about ownership and the dialogue between the players and the ownership. And Nick, now that you're dealing with this, the players were happy to take a salary cut as long as the money went to where they felt it was needed, as opposed to, as Nick was articulating, going into the pockets of the owners. And so that seems to be you know, if there's more transparency, that may be more likely to happen. Should we do rapid fire? We've got 4 minutes to go. We've got rapid fire questions. So this one's from Craig Harris to Nick. To what extent might parachute payments mitigate the difference between the impact that would have on relegated clubs as against the loss of promotion?
Yeah, well, it's obviously very sensible point. If you don't have 3 clubs relegated from the Premier League, you've got the money that would otherwise go to parachute payments that could possibly be used to mitigate the losses of those clubs complaining about not being promoted.
Ed Gross, I think you might have addressed this one. However, in practice, what measures would you consider? Simply a blanket ban on registration? Right, I think you've touched on that one.
Yes.
Ed's point, so we can do that. And then we've got Andre Buzzo, who's been very patiently waiting here on third-party ownership. It's a long one. Right, do you think that the making rules on third-party ownership more sustainable in line with prerogative of contractual stability? Any thoughts on this, or would it be more welcome? Amazing webinar, thank you. I think this is one about sort of changes to the financial models. Do you just want to comment on that? I know we had a panel on that already. But...
Yeah, well, I've always said you should bring back third-party ownership because it's a good way to put investment into football. I know a lot of player unions don't like it, but it's got to be properly regulated. The objection to it, the slavery objection to it, it doesn't work because that's true about clubs owning the rights to buy and sell players. It's no worse that somebody else has invested money in. If football can borrow money from banks over their stadium, why not borrow money over their best assets, which is their players?
Okay. Anyone else want to comment on that, or shall I just move on to the next question? Brendon, you look like a response, but we haven't got time for it. Sorry. So anonymous attendee, and Rustam, look, you're very knowledgeable about this because you've been doing the whole report. I know you've been very humbly quiet there. You've probably got much more to say than I have on this matter. Anyway, so feel free to chip in. Depending on the COVID protocols in each country, where will there be any additional issues between the Schengen countries on transfers that could endanger a deal? Michele?
No, I don't see any risk on this. I mean, if a measure affecting the freedom of movement of workers or citizens in general is taken for public health reasons, then of course this is going to have an effect also on football, but on football players, but on everybody, on all the citizens. There is this the fundamental principle that can be limited for public health reasons. So, of course, there will be an impact if a decision will be taken on the basis of public health.
And then Kevin Offer, I've got no idea what the Duckworth. So a Friday afternoon question, but should football consider a type of Duckworth-Lewis method to decide league promotions, or if the season can't be completed? I've got no idea what that is.
Football, it translates. It was a way of deciding called off matches in cricket. I think in football it translates to a type of either points per game or perhaps home and away weighted points per game system. So different systems of trying to calculate the fairest way.
Thank you for that. I need to brush up on my sports history, obviously. Again, sorry, Nick, but other people can chip in on this. To ensure the stability, this is from Sam Gorgovic. To ensure stability of League One and League Two clubs next season, do you think there should be a cap embedded on agents' fees in a lower league?
No,
of course, you're asking the wrong person. Let's go to someone else on that.
The wrong person there. No cap on agents fees anywhere in the world. It's completely counterproductive. But actually, in relation to League One and League Two clubs, the amount they spend on agents fees is not significant in terms of their overall spending. And it's up to them whether they spend it or not. No one forces them to.
Brendan's already mentioned this in terms of Australia, where they did have a cap negotiated. Did you want to say?
Yeah, and in the United States, I don't see how you can say it's counterproductive. The question I'd ask of you, Nick, is if FIFA was basically unable to regulate agents with any effectiveness, how could it regulate something as complex as third-party ownership? And it's the inability to regulate that was a major decision in the ban, as well as the fact that it's morally objectionable. And now FIFA, of course, has a statutory commitment to human rights. And forced labour is a view. Labour is not a commodity. So we need.
But Brendon, you then have to oppose the transfer system. Then, Brendon, you have to.
No, I think there's a strong. Well, look, you know, well, look, that's.
That's another webinar. That's that. There we go. We just started off another one.
I don't want to philosophically, but what the legitimate objectives about the industry don't apply to third-party ownership. I think the economic point I wanted to make was this: it's just another way of getting external money in to solve a problem when the issues are more foundational than that. And if there's going to be a lesson from this pandemic, let's deal with the foundational issues, as opposed to looking to other possible short-term solutions, which may well exacerbate the foundational problems that exist.
Thank you. Richard Okondo, sorry, we don't have time for that. I'm really sorry. I always get in trouble for running over. I love these type of conversations. I love, you probably guessed, and I'll just keep it going for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to have to be more disciplined and draw it to a close. Before, I'm going to give every speaker the last word. So if you want to hear what everyone's got to say, please hang on for 2 seconds. I said this webinar was part of a series of 22 webinars we did. So we were affected by COVID. We were meant to do an in-person conference. We couldn't do it. So for those of you who don't know about what we're about, we are completely independent. No one can pay to play with what we do. We turn down quite sizable sums of money for people to influence our content because of the audience we have. We have 22,000 members worldwide. We are absolutely privileged though, because the only reason we work is we get to work with great people like our panelists here. And, so Michele always kind of epitomizes really the sort of enthusiasm and the collaborative approach that we take. But all the speakers that we've had, so we need to thank all the speakers that we've had before I let the panelists have the final word. Everyone who's contributed has been absolutely awesome and amazing. And I said, it's one of those things that given this difficult time, it's been incredibly heartwarming, encouraging that like over 85 of the world leading people have got every reason to say no, right? Because everyone's really busy and they don't need the work, have given up their time freely to contribute, including the speakers today. So thank you all sincerely for that. Thank you all for the fabulous people who have tuned in, engaged in the process, ask questions, improve their knowledge. Hopefully you'll go out into the market and have a positive influence. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully it's the right one. We'll see. With all the recordings for the sessions are on LawInSport. We've got some free ones that are on our YouTube channel, but these ones will go on our YouTube channel. But if you want to do it, it was 150 quid if you weren't a Plus member for the whole thing, which is just incredible value for what it is. But anyway, you can access it. It is there. It's available, particularly for those who are attendees. That's all I was going to say to promote that. If you like what we do, please do tell people about it. If you've got value, I can't take the blue screen share off now. If you do like what we do, please do tell people about it. If you enjoyed the webinar, please do tell people about it. If you've got other information you want to share with other people, again, connect. We want community. That's what we're about. Other than that, I've got a glass of wine. So as I've been waiting for this forever, right? So like this is like my wife, and I've got to say thanks to the other thing. Everyone says thanks to me for organising. It's not me. It's everyone else involved. Thanks to the team. Thanks to Rustam, thanks to Chris, Amy, John Cullen, everyone who's my wife, who's my son, my oldest son's up here twice in these things. Huge thanks to everyone for that and for the patience for 2 weeks. So it was a bad idea, basically. Didn't think it through when you've got kids at home. So final words though from our amazing speakers. Rustam, do you want to go first? You've been sitting there very patiently. I'm very conscious that.
Yeah, probably because this has been a fantastic experience for me personally. My first panel and to learn from the esteemed colleagues that we have here is fantastic. But I think echoing the sentiment of what everyone else has previously said, if we can find a way that we can somehow find, if we can find a way that gets the money flowing back to the grassroots and the community clubs, and for the long term, I think then we will really be winning. Because right now it seems like it's a vicious cycle for those guys who rely heavily on gate receipts. And if this is to continue for a long time behind closed doors, there really is a danger of them folding. So rather than spontaneous big money contributions from the federations, governments that probably get caught up at the top level, I think it's equally important that money filters its way down.
Well said, Rustam. Thank you for that. I want Michele to finish because he's got the most energy out of everyone, and I think we need that. Nick, do you want to go next? Then we go Brendon and Michele.
Yeah, I just want to echo what you said, Sean, and thank LawInSport for organising this great panel and all your work. And because it is Friday, it's aperitivo time, and especially to my Neapolitan cousin who can talk even more than I can. Salute.
Brendon.
Salute.
I think the most sensible thing that Nick said was, as an Aston Villa supporter, that there should be no relegation. So I've been paying the burden for my father purchasing me a shirt when I was 4 years of age to support the mighty Villains. So I fully agree with you on that point, Sean. No relegation from the Premier League. But on a more serious note, Sean, congratulations. I know you've got an incredible team behind you. I won't speak anymore. Everyone's tired. Have a great weekend, everybody. 22 days, I think you said, it's an extraordinary performance, but the quality of your content's always there. And we're very pleased to, we get a great benefit ourselves by working with you and the community that you bring together. And we've still got a lot to learn, a long way to go. It's only, as Michele says, we're giving him the final word because I think it's going to be a passionate message about collaboration and learning from each other.
From one of the best. Michele.
22 webinars in 2 weeks. Sean, you are crazy. Literally crazy. But we love you. We love you for this because you are a wonderful person. You have this gift to be able to connect people, to create this wonderful network, to create this wonderful network of speakers, sports lawyers, academics. We need to learn from each other. And you are doing a fantastic job in this. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you guys. And I say this, there's probably about 400 people who contribute to everything. The only reason we can do 22 webinars is because there is so many people willing to contribute. If it was just me going, or my colleagues, Chris or John or everyone going, let's do a webinar, and we couldn't talk to anyone, no one wants to talk to us, it wouldn't work. It truly is a community effort. And I think, to say that, and I'm very appreciative of it. So it was a real pleasure. And thanks for all the amazing questions. It's been, like I said, I need to go back and watch everything now for the next couple of weeks. And Michele, when we're getting this report out that I've been helping delay,
tonight.
Soon tonight. So this is my last glass of wine. Cheers, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got a lot from it. Have a great, fabulous weekend. Stay safe. Let's look forward to more football coming back and more sport. And keep well, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.